You're listening to the STEMxm podcast, highlighting women in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And now, your host, Mel the Engineer.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 15 of the STEMxm podcast. I am your host, Mel the Engineer, and this is being recorded in early 2017, so I'm very happy to be rejoining you after a nice break for the holidays. And I hope you're ready to conquer your New Year goals and resolutions. Let's get right into today's episode. Today, we've got our first real tech guest on the show, Andrea Goulet. Andrea is the CEO of Corgi Bytes, which is a software development shop dedicated to modernizing software applications. Andrea boasts a decade of marketing experience, but she's also an adept coder. As the Corgi Bytes CEO, she has built a team of expert engineers who love working with legacy code. The team helps software companies scale their product and make their own operations more productive. Andrea is going to speak to us about this in the interview, but so you've got an idea going in, their company basically remodels code, much like you would remodel a house in need of updates. So they can remodel software so it's more modular, flexible, and responsive to business needs. And they can update frameworks and languages to help prevent security breaches. So during her non-coding time, Andrea speaks at conferences and on podcasts like STEMxm about communication, empathy-driven software development, releasing the imposter syndrome, and software remodeling. So let's take a listen, and I'll be back with you at the end to discuss show notes. Andrea Goulet, thank you so much for joining us today on STEMxm.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
All right, so I want to talk to you about your background and then kind of move in through the path of how you got to where you are today. So let's go way back. Tell us about when you were a kid. What did your parents do that maybe sparked some of your initial interest in technology?
Oh, well, my dad was a huge technologist. And I have to say, my dad is probably the biggest influence on my career than anyone. So my parents ran a graphic design business out of our home in the late 80s. And early 90s. So they, now it's like everyone works from home and they work on their computers and they have their kind of home office studio. No one did that in the 80s, but my parents did. My dad had worked for a large corporation that was very similar to kind of Best Buy. They were an electronics retailer, and my dad ran the data center. And because it was this large enterprise company, he had the opportunity to look at all these different computers in the 80s and just really saw that Macintosh was kind of pulling ahead. And when the Macintosh came out in 1984, he was super intrigued and just said, this thing is going to change the world. So in 1985, he quit his big corporate job and started a company with my mom called Designs Unlimited, and they did graphic design from our house using that little computer. And I was 4 or 5 years old when that happened. So pretty much my entire life, I've seen people connected. I've seen people working from home. I've seen computers be a very integral part of life. And I just remember my dad being such a visionary. He still is. It's awesome to talk to him. But I remember I was in middle school or something, and I said, Dad, I want to be a secretary. That's the thing that my school says. I took the little test that says what you're going to be good at. And my dad's response was, well, sorry to break it to you, honey, but you're going to have to figure out something else because nobody's going to have secretaries when you're grown up, because we're all going to have computers the size of a credit card that we just put in our pocket, and they're going to be our secretaries. So, and this was in the mid 90s.
Oh, that is visionary. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, so it was really neat just to have someone who was that encouraging, and to be imbued with this vision of kind of how technology is going to just absolutely change our lives and how it continues to change our lives. Yeah, nowadays if you talk to him, he's all about graphene and blockchain, and like he still hasn't lost that visionary thing, and he still talks about where things are going to be 30 years from now. So yeah, he's pretty awesome. I would say he's had the biggest influence on me.
That's awesome. So when you were growing up, was there technology that you were playing with? Did you learn to code at a young age? What were you doing?
So I learned how to use technology really well, and I learned to code, but at the same time, I didn't know that I learned how to code. So there was a program on the Mac called HyperCard, and I just remember like playing with it, and I thought it was a game, and like I remember being all these rooms, and you could do all this visual stuff with it. Well, it turns out that's like programming. You like I was programming. It would be very similar to, I let my kids play with the games on code.org or Scratch. And it's like to them, they're just building a game.
Mm-hmm.
Like it didn't feel like coding. It wasn't until I hit middle and high school that I really just kind of opted out, and I actively opted out. Because I didn't want to be seen as that smart girl who was good at math, right? So, and I felt culturally like I remember playing with a girl talk Barbie, and they said, the Barbie, you press it, and it would say, "Math is hard. Let's go shopping."
Oh my
And
God.
yeah, so I think it's really interesting looking at my life because I had this like really amazing parental figure who was just feeding me all sorts of technology. Like the way I learned how to play piano, which I never really learned very well, was my dad bought me like a MIDI keyboard with a Nintendo game, and it would teach you how to play piano in like fourth grade. And that was just like crazy novel. Now it's like that's exactly how my husband's learning how to play guitar. Like he's got an iPhone app and he plays his guitar, he plugs it in and it checks to see if he's correct. Um, so used technology a ton for life skills, but didn't really feel like I was empowered to create technology. I felt more like I was a user or a seller or an evangelist or something that was more appropriate for women. But I have always struggled, and I still honestly struggle with feeling like I'm allowed to dive into the code.
Mm-hmm.
And I love it. I enjoy it. And at the same time, I feel like, is this something I'm allowed to do? Like, I don't
Right.
know. It's hard to say. So there's a lot of cultural weight. There's a lot of cultural kind of stuff that's hard to shake.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to get to your progression in thinking through these different concepts. So what happened after high school? What happened between high school and the reunion?
Yeah. So in high school, I worked like there was this great guy named Scott that I was really, really good friends with. And Scott was president of the computer club and just really got technology. And so he and I would just have a ton of technological discourse. Like we would talk about the state of technology in the industry and have these really great conversations. Um, After college, I got my degree in marketing because it seemed really pragmatic. I didn't even know what marketing was until I got my degree in it. Turned out I was good at it. I really enjoyed selling. I liked connecting with people, and I really enjoyed communication. My communication classes were really easy and really engaging and really fun, and I felt really natural there. And so I worked as a communication consultant for years. I started out in sales and the way that I sold was basically my company gave me a database of like 3,000 names. And they said, okay, here you go. And they gave me a lot of latitude. And my, my motto for sales was I'm not lazy, I'm efficient, which I knew I was a developer when I said that, right? Like, that's because there's a thing in software development called DRY, which is don't repeat yourself. And it's like the best engineers and the best developers are inherently lazy because they want to find the most efficient way to do things. So basically I was given these 3,000 names and I created a software system that basically enabled me to send out a series of letters at exactly the right time. So then that way I just would go to networking events, I would get inputs, I would enter the business cards, I would run them through my system, and then I let that run for a year. And within a year, I was the number 3 sales rep in the nation. And it was because I was really efficient at some of this. So it was kind of that merging of software and communication that I've always been really, 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 really interested in, that intersection. And then I worked for a little while at some really big brands. So Capital One, I worked there for a while, working in their branding department. And then I worked for an agency where I was the human voice behind a lot of the really big brands that you know today. And I've done work for lots of very well-known enterprise companies that I wish I could say that I have non-disclosure agreements, unfortunately. So I really kind of understood what was it that made that human connection and communication. But and then at my 10-year reunion, I reconnected with Scott. And of course, we hit it right off. We were really good friends in high school, hadn't really seen each other in 10 years. And he had a business and said, I've looked at all the different things that you've been doing, and I realized that my business isn't taking off because I have a marketing problem. And I think I want to hire you but I don't want to just hire you as a consultant. I want you to be my business partner. So he offered me 51% of the company if I would come on board and be his boss. And so I did, and that was in 2009, so 8 years ago. And so that was my introduction to Corgi Bytes and kind of back into the world of software. So that was, I think, where my engineering journey started.
Right. So what did you have to get from him at that point to feel comfortable with that decision? Like, what did you want to know about the company and the solution that he had created, and walk us through your decision-making process there?
Well, the decision-making process was really like, is he going to listen to me? Like, that was the decision-making process. So, I think part of it was just, it didn't feel like a big risk because at the time it was 51% of nothing. Like, I think the bank account balance was like $12 or something. So it was like, okay, we'll go in on this together. And it felt like I was still working at Capital One at the time. So it was like, okay, this will be a fun hobby on the side. So it didn't really feel like a big risk. But what I looked for Scott's passion, and I looked for his dedication. And is this something that he's really interested in? And is he going to defer to my expertise as a marketer and as a business consultant? Because I really kind of understood the business side of things. That I felt really comfortable with, even though I didn't know too much about the software at that point. I knew what made a profitable business. And I knew how influential good communication was to building a business and building a brand. And so basically I took one look at the thing that he was building. And I was like, no one wants to buy this. So the first thing that we have to do is scrap this product and go after and do some target market analysis and understand what people really want. And the answer to that was, okay, let's do this. I trust you. If he had said, no, I want you to sell this thing, I probably wouldn't. I probably would have said, no, we'll walk away. But because Scott really has trusted me and he's trusted my advice, and it's been a true partnership, not I'm the engineer, so I know everything, right? I think both of us are really try to be kind of humble to the other, and so it's been that both of us have these different experiences, and we learn from each other, and we kind of meet in the middle, and that's what's enabled us to be successful.
That's awesome. So you guys went to do this target market kind of research. How did you figure out what you needed to focus on?
So we looked at kind of our skill set, and we just started talking to people. So, the people that I knew a lot of graphic designers. And so this was in 2008, 2009, was when we kind of really started taking off. And our very first kind of business idea was that we would serve independent designers who needed to know how to code and how to write in order to get an app off the ground. So building apps was like a really big thing. And we noticed that when people wanted, like, if an entrepreneur had an idea for a software application, they would never go to a software developer or a copywriter. They would go to a visual designer first. So we formed a lot of partnerships, and just this was part of us just knowing the industry and talking to people. And so we started a business where the core of it was that the idea would be that there were kind of three legs of a stool. So there's visual design, content, and code. And so those three need to be present. And so we said, well, we'll be an agency where we're two legs of that three-legged stool. And so we'll market directly to designers who have the visual design, but coding feels really hard, or they don't know how to do it, or they're having trouble with the content. And so what that ended up doing was we didn't sell too many projects that matched our cohesive vision. I ended up continuing to build on some of the work that I had done already of, working with very large brands, helping with content strategy, like doing the information architecture for websites, doing brand style guides. So the content side of the house really sustained the coding side for a while because people weren't willing to pay what it really took to get an app off the ground. And we had a lot of people who would say, they would come to us with kind of half-formed business plans and say, well, I can't pay you for this, but can you do it with equity? And we're like, well, equity isn't gonna, and we didn't feel like it was a really great business, and we didn't want to become investors either. Like we weren't in a position there. So we ended up eating ramen for a good 2 years, and eventually we ended up kind of shutting down because just didn't quite make it work. So then we went back and both got consulting jobs and kind of thought, well, that was fun. We gave the entrepreneur thing a try. And so Scott got a job at a product company, and then that's folded. That was a startup, and it didn't work. And then there was another company that he worked for that was a consultancy, but he didn't like the culture there. So eventually we got to the point where we said, okay, let's take this again. And now we have, 2 more years of like really good insight. And we did some more analysis into looking at what people needed. And we realized that there are a lot of software projects out there that had been built, but they needed to be kind of remodeled, just like you would a house. So they were no longer serving the purposes of the company. And that was a skill set that Scott loved doing. And that in order to do that well, you have to have really good communication. So the space that is kind of called is sometimes called legacy code, where you have these older software projects where just people don't know what's working on it. It's really hard to get context around it. And so we kind of stumbled on that and have just continued to refine that over the past 4 years. And that has been really what's stuck. And so now it's, that's what Corgi Bytes is kind of known for is taking those there. I call it sodding sometimes. So it's taking what's called a brownfield application, which is a software product that is just really hard to work on. No one wants to touch it. And turning it into a greenfield application, which developers use that term to say something that's fun, that has that's really easy to work on, where the creativity is just kind of flowing. And the thing that really was the crux of it was that the thing that it takes to turn a brownfield application into a greenfield application is the skill that I bring, which doesn't feel technical, but it's incredibly technical, which is communication. And so it's all of these communication artifacts and how you talk about things and how your engineering team is talking to each other and how your business team is talking to the engineering team and how that maps to a bigger vision. And so it's all of these, I call them communication artifacts, that are left throughout the code base that then turn the brownfield application into the greenfield application. So it's been really interesting, just this intersection of communication, empathy, vulnerability, all these things that feel really not engineering at all, but they're so critical to pulling projects off and doing them well.
Absolutely. Yeah. As you were describing that just now, the word that came to mind for me is amalgamation. It's just this kind of mixing of all these important things that, even though, like you said, some of it doesn't feel technical, it's critical for your technical application to be successful in the business setting. You've got to have these other components. You have to have people who can communicate with the client about something technical and have that back and forth in order to get them what they need. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
that's really that's interesting, and it's so great that you got to come back into this interest of yours from this kind of roundabout way, if you will.
Yeah.
Okay, so chat with us for a little bit about you've mentioned something kind of like the imposter syndrome. How has that influenced you over time, and how has your mindset changed on that?
Oh, I definitely have imposter syndrome. Um, so, it started, I think, where it really started when, in order for Core Bytes to take off, it became evident that I had to learn how to code. Because for the longest time, I felt like I could kind of be safe, and I was like, well, I'll do my copywriting, and I'll do my content, and I'll do my business strategy. But until I really committed myself to learning how to code, I wasn't going to be able to understand some of the problems, the engineering problems that Scott was talking about. So he was talking about things like needing 3 hours of like really hardcore focus time, and where he was just completely non-interruptible. And I was like, that's impossible. Like, we run a business together. That's just not something that we can do. And it's one of these things, like, it wasn't until I went to learn how to code that I pretty much said the exact same thing. I was like, oh my God, I can't focus. Like, I have to have like these large blocks of just uninterrupted time. He's like, see, I told you. So it wasn't until I learned to become an engineer myself that I really understood why some of these things that Scott was asking for were so important, and was able to build around the culture.
How did you initiate that learning process?
I did kind of a self-taught thing, and I think that's something where my imposter syndrome still comes up, because I don't have a certificate or a degree or anything. Like, I've watched a ton of YouTube videos. I've gone through things on Free Code Camp. I've, taken things on EDX, like the CS50 class from Harvard, and I'm just constantly learning. There's a Python course on the Great Courses. Like, I'm just constantly looking for new content, but I haven't like sat down and taken a class or like gotten my degree in engineering. And I'm actually still like always looking at graduate programs, like, maybe if I got a degree, then I would feel like an engineer. And it's really interesting, because there's been a lot of research that shows that, at least in the software world, having the degree doesn't make a difference. So there are people who can be just as good of software developers who are completely self-taught as they are, the people who have degrees. And I feel like that's the same with communication too. Like, it's something that you can teach yourself. It's a skill that's very accessible. It's made itself really easy to learn how to do it better and learn how to do it well. So I just kind of have just made it a habit of getting in the code and diving in. And Scott, we also made it so that I had a couple of projects that I was responsible for at work. So, for example, our website. And if I wanted to make a change, like, we have it, so it's set up, it's a Jekyll project. And so it's, using Liquid, and I was responsible for it. And like, I had to figure out how to get the server up, and I had to figure out how to code it the way I wanted to. And if I wanted to do it, Scott's like, well, you're just going to have to figure it out. Right. This is your baby now. And I think that's one of the ways that I learn best, is by actually getting my hands dirty and learning and doing it. And I've got some open source projects that I've launched or contributed to. And pair programming has been huge. So having other developers now that like we work together, and then when we get more than two people, we call it a mob, right? So we'll have several people who are all working on something at once. And then that way too, I'm a very social creature. And so I enjoy problem solving together. And that's really where I think taken away the most. But I still feel like an imposter many times because and the thing that's interesting about imposter syndrome is I used to think that it was a women's issue, that women felt it more than men, but in my research of it, I've found that it's actually a high achievers problem. So men experience this just as much as women. But and it really has to do with, are you a perfectionist? Like, are you kind of that type A person? And my motto for a long time was, I'm not type A, I'm type A plus, where it's like I am such a perfectionist. And that's really hard. I think that's really hard because part of software engineering is you've just got to dive in and make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And feeling like you can try new things. And I know for me, like when I was first learning command line, I would just do like ls and cd, which is, list, like it lists all the different things in the directory, and then cd is change directory. And it's like, I knew I couldn't break anything if I just did those two functions. And so like just getting comfortable, because I had this very big fear of, this feels foreign, this feels like a black box. I feel like if I press the wrong button, I'm going to destroy the internet. And just not knowing what the implications were felt really, really scary to me. I felt like there was a big risk of failure, like massive risk of failure. But, and I have definitely failed, but not quite to that extreme. So.
Today on the STEMxm podcast, we're hearing from coder and Corgi Bytes CEO Andrea Goulet. She's speaking with us about how she has dealt with the imposter syndrome and also how her company creatively works with legacy code to solve problems for their clients. So with Corgi Bytes, I'm just curious. So this legacy code that y'all deal with, does it usually have to do with software that's been built specifically for a business, or is it website stuff, or is it something else?
So it's really interesting. That's a great question. I'm seeing that, back in the day, like 10 years ago, there used to be web applications, and then you had static websites, and they were very distinct and different. Like you had desktop applications that you ran, and you had websites. And the lines over the years have become incredibly blurry. So now, like, you have websites that have a lot of content and they provide a lot of things, but at the same time, they're very tied in to a lot of other business features. So, for example, let's say you've got an e-commerce company, right? You're going to have a website that has all of pictures of and descriptions, but you're also going to have pay features where then it checks inventory, right? So you can take kind of a static website, but then you can tie it into all of these other systems. And the way that we do that is through what's called an API, which is basically just a bridge that allows two different systems to talk to each other, two different software systems. So the websites have really now become almost the hub of a lot of different web apps. So anything that you see that has a login button, right? It's both a website, but it's also a web application. So we're seeing much fewer desktop applications these days and a lot more web applications. And part of that is because the cost of, servers is going down dramatically. So cloud computing has really enabled things to be built very quickly and very cheaply, which means that you can kind of plug and play and move all these things. And then the API that I talked about, people will build specifically that so that they focus on the integration of their software application with all of these other ones. So one of the ones that's kind of been the most successful are things like Slack, right? And Salesforce, right? The reason that Slack and Salesforce have really taken off is not so much because, they are great products, but they've really focused on making their product play well with others. And a big reason is through their API. So it's been really interesting, this kind of like integration. And I think of it as systems that are talking to each other through APIs. And then through the systems, you're enabling users to talk to each other, right? And you're enabling business to function more efficiently. So
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, it's really interesting to see kind of how all of these different things work together. Um, but yeah, a lot there's think I mean just the software that it's become so integral to our lives. Um, and there's so much of it out there. So much of it out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love Slack. I dream of a day when I could work in a space where there's no email and we just do everything on Slack.
That's what we do at Corgi Bites. I
Really?
have just pretty much eliminated email. I mean, we use it. I have an autoresponder up now, and I'm like, I'm not checking email. If you want, you can communicate with me on Slack if you're already a client. Like, but here's my executive assistant, and here's my office manager, and here's my director of sales, and here's everybody else. And email has become a very low priority communication channel for me because Slack has just really replaced that.
Yeah. And it puts so many things out in the open and cuts down on back and forth so much.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting case study in communication. So one of the reasons that Slack has really taken off is because it's a one-to-many communication channel. So before I was the bottleneck to all of these different projects, right? And I just felt like, like people would email me and my only job was basically like telling somebody else that information. And now Slack, because you can have group channels, like somebody else will just get it and get to it. And so it takes some of the cognitive load and some of the process load off of me.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really interesting, it was looked at other successful projects and kind of the communication structures that were set up. And so for an example, the Apollo missions, when we think of NASA, we tend to think of this really bureaucratic, command and control type of agency. And that didn't really come about until the 80s with the shuttle project. And in the 60s, when they were doing the Apollo missions, they had what were called comm loops. And so it was basically a phone channel that was always open. And so you would have an engineer, if they had a question on, the flight controls, they would pick up the phone for flight controls and they would just listen in to whoever was talking on flight controls. And they would get their question answered and then they would put the phone down. And I was like, that is Slack. Right?
It's like audio Slack. Yeah.
Yeah. And so one of the things that as engineers that prohibits us from actually executing is communication. And there's actually a software principle. Well, it's not just software, but there's a systems principle called Conway's Law that talks about this, which says that any system, so you can think of an engineering system or a business system or a software system, is going to be a reflection of the communication structures that are set up within an organization. And as an engineer, the thing that is the biggest slowdown to your productivity is getting questions answered. Right?
Yes.
So it's like you're going wrong and you're focused, and then it's like, oh shoot, I have to get this question answered. Like you hit a fork in the road because you're like, well, if it's this, then I've got to go this way, and if it's this, I've got to go this way.
Mm-hmm.
And so in software, usually you have to talk to a business analyst or a product owner. If you're a civil engineer, you've got to talk to, different people in the town, but you've got to talk to different domain experts. And the faster that you can get that information, then the less likely you are to get out of your flow state where you're just solving problems and being creative. We tend to think of engineering as this very analytical kind of career, but it's incredibly creative. I don't think we give engineers enough credit because that's all you're doing is you're solving problems all day, and you can't do that without creativity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So if you think about the Apollo missions, that's exactly what they did. Was they had all of these different things where they just said, okay, you can chime in, and we're just going to set up group kind of topic areas. And so then as the engineers, they would just kind of put together, and they would say, okay, I have this question. Anybody answer it? And because everybody was talking about things in that group comm link, the amount of time, the amount of wait time got lowered significantly. So that's really what I think Corgi Bytes has focused on, is those communication patterns and those communication structures that get in the way of engineers being really productive. And that's how we're able to kind of break through some of the legacy state, because it's not necessarily that the code is bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's that you can't get context, or you can't get your questions answered about really important things that you need to know in order to make progress on it. So yeah, so Slack is definitely our friends. We actually have it in our contracts that all of our clients are required to use Slack.
Have any of them kind of like fought you a little bit about that in the beginning, and then you've converted them because it's so great?
Yeah, I have for sure. Yeah, and I mean, we've just said, look, this is something that's really important for us to be able to do our jobs well. And we are now at the point where there are some clients where it's like they've got their own internal tools, and so they want us to use that. So the way we've done that is we charge an extra like fee for, outside of kind of standard operating procedures. So if you want us to use something else, like, we will.
Mm-hmm.
But it's going to cost you, because there's a cost to us. Like like for an engineer to have to context switch, I think that's the biggest challenge. And once I saw that, then I could start putting some language around it. So we started talking about things like inception layers, where, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Inception, but it's got like Leonardo DiCaprio and Ellen, I can't remember her last name. She was in Juno. But the whole idea is that there's this like dream. You're in a dream, almost like the Matrix kind of thing. And it's like, once you realize that you're in a dream, the dream starts crumbling.
Mm-hmm.
And so the whole movie is about what would happen if you were in a dream within a dream within a dream. And that's, I think, what happens as an engineer, which is why you need those large blocks of time, because you have a problem within another problem. And if you're down at like Inception layer 3, and then somebody comes to you and says, hey, you got a minute, you get like popped up, and you almost get this like mental equivalent of the bends, like decompression sickness.
Yeah.
Because you're just like, you watch your entire problem domain that took you like probably an hour and a half to like get to, just crumble. And then the poor person who asked you if you got a minute like sees the look on your face. This happened with me and Scott all the time. It took us like 5 years to like deconstruct what was happening. And so a lot of it is around communication again. So what we do now is we just say inception level. So because we're wearing our headphones all the time. And this happened last night. And so if it's, higher than, like, we use higher than a 2 at Corgi Bytes, then that means that you're not interruptible. And the difference is that because saying 2 is just labeling where you are. There's not a lot of cognition or thinking or problem solving that goes into that. But somebody asking an open-ended question like, hey, you got a minute, it requires a lot of analysis.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's an example of a framework that's worked really well. And it's like the communication systems need to serve. The entire purpose for the communication systems is to keep your engineers in flow so that they can get to the deepest levels of inception that they need to.
Right. And that method takes the emotion out of it too. So then there's not they didn't have time for me, they must not want to talk to me kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's no like miscommunication that can come from it. It's very direct.
Yeah. And so, then the way we say it is like, if somebody pings you and asks for your inception layer, like, that's go and find them later when you've come back up quote, to the surface.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then, and it goes the other way too. Like I do strategic planning, and like instead of going really deep into the details, I have to go really broad and big picture.
Mm-hmm.
And so it works the other way too. But that's been a really useful kind of communication structure that Scott and I have kind of figured out on how to work together. But I couldn't identify or articulate what those things were until I actually experienced it for myself.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those things were like, I prevented myself from being able to learn how to code. And like I remember we were on a trip, and Scott had been on a podcast similar to this one. And we were listening, and Scott had referred to me as his non-technical business partner. And I remember just like when I heard him say it, I got like really upset because we had been in business for many years together. And I was like, I'm technical. Like I coded this whole website. Like like what's it going to take for me to be called technical in your eyes? Like, do I have to get a degree? Do I have to do, like, what do I need to do? And like, Scott is so great. He just took like a really deep breath and kind of calmly said, Andrea, the reason I said that is because that's exactly what you said about yourself in a client meeting yesterday. So I'm just taking your lead. And when you start calling yourself technical, I'll start calling you technical. Yeah. And that was like the most profound moment, I think, in my career, because it really put the onus on me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, learning to call myself technical has been definitely a journey, and I'm in the process of writing a book on it, because it's like there's so much self-reflection that you have to go through. And the biggest thing that I've actually found is it's less about the imposter syndrome, and it is more about this thing called the confidence gap. So one of the things that I found interesting is there's some research from Hewlett-Packard where they were having trouble figuring out why women weren't applying for their executive positions. They wanted this to be a thing, and women just flat out weren't applying, like even people who were very qualified. And it turns out that men will apply. So they started quantifying, and they did a lot of research around this. And so it turns out that men will apply for a job if they meet 60% of the criteria on a job description. Women, and I totally identified with this, 100%. So women will sit there and say, oh, it says 7+ years of experience. I have 6.5. I'm just not going to apply.
Mm-hmm.
And like and I saw myself doing that all the time. So for me, it was like, in order for me to feel comfortable calling myself technical, I felt like I had to have mastery of like 15 different programming languages, and I had to have a portfolio that was like could get me a job at NASA. And like the idea of like what technical meant,
mm-hmm.
I had set the bar so high that it was not achievable.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, I had to figure out what was that thing that it was for myself that I felt like, yeah, I am technical. I've built these websites and I can totally code an app. And if you give me no other things and I had time to focus, like, yeah, I could totally learn whatever.
Right. Absolutely. And so you wrote this really fantastic article that you put on LinkedIn, and that's how I found you. And it was called Technical, Non-Technical, Both. And so I want to read a little excerpt from that right now and talk about this a little bit. So you're talking about your husband here, and you say, we both in very different ways were involved in technology well before our peers. But at the reunion, no one was surprised that the congenial social butterfly had ended up in sales, and no one was surprised that the shy computer geek worked as a software developer. But what has surprised me is learning that we were pushed into these archetypes by our culture. The toys we played with, the media we consumed, the structure of our school curriculum, the norms at our workplaces had molded us into an almost one-dimensional characterization of what society expected of us. So I believe that there's other women and young women out there who are feeling this, and they're coming to realize this. What is your message for them?
Oh, I think, get curious and don't like my favorite box that I've ever checked was I had to fill out a like survey recently for attending a conference. Like I was the keynote speaker at this conference called .NET Fringe. And they wanted me to talk about communication. And I felt really my imposter syndrome was going off because I was like, I don't know C# very well. Like I code mostly in JavaScript and Ruby. Like who am I to be speaking at this conference? Like I was speaking right after Scott Hanselman, who is this like really well-known podcaster. I was like, who am I to be talking about legacy code and getting up on stage? And they sent this survey around just to kind of get a sense. And they were like, what do you code in and this and stuff. And at the bottom of each one of the answers, they had, don't put me in your silly little boxes. And I love that. And I was like, this is where, oh my God, I automatically feel more comfortable at this conference. Where it's like, so I would say that whenever somebody is asking you a question about where you belong, or you're seeing yourself like, oh, I have to be this thing, add another option to the bottom of that of don't put me in your silly little boxes, right? Like, because you can be both. Right. And this is another example. Like I had a Facebook message, like we just recently we're recording this in January and I live in Virginia and we got a lot of snow recently. And I posted on Facebook because it was a snow day and I was like talking about feminism and, smashing the patriarchy while I was making cupcakes from scratch with like buttercream ice cream. Right. And so it's like, the idea of a feminist and somebody who cares about, gender equality doesn't mean that you can't also enjoy things that are traditionally domestic. Mm-hmm. The biggest thing is that you feel comfortable with you and that you're doing things that you feel are true to your heart and true to your passions, and to recognize that most things in life are a skill, right? Baking is a skill. Learning how to get a stain out of a couch is a skill that I clearly have not learned. I am not like a cleaning person at all. Coding is a skill. Engineering is a skill. Communicating is a skill. And skills are things that you can learn. Like you can attain them. It just takes time and it takes focus. So one of the things that I have learned is that early in my career, I would immediately discount myself. Like, oh, I'm not going to take that math class because I'm not going to be good at it. I'm not going to take that computer class because, I'm not going to like it. And it turns out that I really did like a lot of these things. Mm-hmm. But I prejudged it before I actually did it. And I expected perfection before I really tried things. So I guess my message is get curious and make mistakes. There's a great quote. I don't know who to attribute it to because I saw it on like a little cross stitch thing, but it said a mistake is proof that you tried something. And so instead of thinking of it as a failure, it's evidence. You're leaving behind a trail of evidence that you have been a courageous person who tried new things. And you cannot live a courageous life without making mistakes.
Yep, those are very, very wise words. So that's kind of towards the end of my question. So I think what I'd like to do is ask you, for young women who are interested in coding or software development, looking forward, what opportunities do you see coming? Like if you tapped into your dad's visionariness, what would you see coming and what would you recommend to these young folks?
Well, I think the nice thing about software is that it transcends industries because software runs our lives. So one of the neat things about software engineering is pick a passion, right? If you're passionate about nonprofits and social justice, guess what? Like there's donation management systems and software that runs nonprofits and helps build, social justice that is really, really critical. If you care about healthcare, like you can make better ultrasound machines. So I think software and just engineering in general is such a fantastic place to be because you can align it very very clearly. Like, so for example, me with communication, it's like I found this like tiny little niche where it's like software and, so I think that's the thing that I love the most is that pick your passion, and then knowing how to code is like knowing how to communicate. And I think the biggest thing that I see is that, for my generation, I'm in my mid 30s. So, for my generation, my dad, he was like, we're not going to have people who type anymore, right? Like the idea of like a secretary who sits outside of your door and like types everything. It's like, oh my God, freaking learn how to type, because that is so what I see for my son's generation, like he's 4, is that he's going to view coding to how I view typing. Like it's just going to be a skill that like everyone knows.
Mm-hmm.
It's a critical business skill, and learn it because you're going to need to know it, and you're going to need to learn how to learn it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the most important thing. It's not necessarily learning this one, language, because it really depends on where you want to go and what domain you're in. But learning to have the belief that you can learn anything is so, so important. And that's genuinely where I see is like it's just going to be this like, yeah, everybody does that. Like you can't type your own emails, like you can't code your own solution to this problem. Like just dive into the code and modify it. Like I see that that's where, kind of in 20, 30 years folks are going to be. So, yeah.
Okay, 2 follow-up questions. In your opinion, what are some of the better resources that people can access online to learn coding or to kind of start that journey?
Yeah. One of my favorites is called Free Code Camp. I love, love, love this project. It's a totally open source project. There's a great community behind it. It teaches some of the most, it teaches not just how to do something, but it teaches the critical thinking that's behind it. And it's been really built, for the self-taught person. So I am a huge fan. I think also code.org. There's a lot of stuff there. And what I did honestly, when I first got started was I looked up coding for kids. Like there was one called Code Combat that it's like a game. So, you've got your hero and they're going through and fighting all these goblins, and you're writing JavaScript as you go, and you've got to write like loops, and you've got to, and making it fun, like, because there's a ton of resources out there. We tend to separate learning a new skill as, oh, well, I'm an adult, so now I have to learn in this way that's like really boring. and I think one of the ways that I found the most joy was doing the things that were really meant for kids.
Mm-hmm.
And they say this like as, if you're learning a new language too, like go find kids books, right? Because they're going to be written for the beginner. And that gives you the confidence too, that then you can kind of step up. Because one of the challenges in software development is just there's a lot of terminology that you've got to understand before you can even wrap your brain around some of the things that folks are saying. And I found that there were some lectures that had been built by people who had a lot of this assumed knowledge. And so they would use words like instantiate or abstraction, or, that I was just like, what are you talking about? Like, that doesn't even seem like a word, but it is a word, and it's very specific in software. And it wasn't until I heard it over and over again. So going to, Khan Academy has a bunch of different, things that are really great for learning some of those more conceptual things. EDX is really good too. There's a class there, CS50 by Harvard, that goes over a lot of, what are these different concepts. And so for me, like as not just somebody who's new to coding, but also kind of new to the industry, I also had to learn a lot of terminology. And so I found some of those more contextual classes really, really helpful.
Okay.
So.
Awesome. All right. And then my last question is just you're a woman in tech, and you're also a business owner, and you're a mother. Do you have any thoughts on the balance question and managing all of this?
I mean, my thought is to not overthink it.
Yeah.
Right? Because and I think part of it is no one asks Scott how he manages it all, right? And so I'm like, I don't know. I just do, right? At every single I'm going to Europe 3 times this year for conferences. I'm speaking at different conferences. And I'm in the spring, I've got one where I'm going to Philly and then one that's going to Boston. And so I'm like, okay, Scott, here's what I think we might be able to do. Let's try an experiment. I've always wanted to rent an RV for a week. So what if we rent an RV and we take the kids with us and then we work from the RV and then and so it's we just kind of find solutions to make it work. And that's, I think, one of the beauties of being an engineer is you're a really good problem solver. And so just finding ways to make it work. We ended up moving in with Scott's parents so that we could have more flexibility. We have someone who is my executive assistant, and one of her jobs is that she comes to the house at 8:30 in the morning and takes the kids to school. So then that way I can be at meetings at 9:00, because otherwise my kids will throw fits, and it was the time dependent thing. So it's you just solve problems the way that you would attack them, as an engineer. And you just figure out, you prioritize things, and you say, okay, this is more important. For me right now, flexibility and having help with the kids is more important to me than owning a big house, right? So we live in a small 1,700 square foot house with Scott's parents, and we're saving a ton of money, and I love it. And we've got the disposable income to kind of do a lot of this travel that we wouldn't have if we had invested in a big house. So a lot of it is just using those same skills that you have as an engineer for prioritization, for problem solving, and just applying it to life in general, and then kind of not overthinking it and just going, hey, my life's pretty cool right now. Everything's just kind of working, and
Well,
so.
and part of the underlying thing that I hear in your situation is that Scott is a real partner to you, not just in business, but also with the relationship and all that.
And I think it comes back to the initial question that you asked, what was it that made me decide to go into business with him? And then we were business partners first, and then 2 years later we got married. And a lot of it was that he's an awesome partner. Yeah, I mean, very much an equal partner. And that was my kind of criteria, was if he had discounted my ideas and said, no, the fact that he offered me 51% was a big deal, right? He's like, no, you're more than an equal partner. Your skills are really important, and he's constantly listened to me. But at the same time, he's challenged me. And I think that, he would probably say the same thing about me, is that it is this, not just saying yes, it's constantly challenging and helping and ebbing and flowing, and lots of couples counseling and business coaches and getting help and getting support, and that can come in many, many, many different forms. But yeah, for me in particular, having Scott as a business and a life partner, I mean, there's no way I could do this business without him. So it definitely is a partnership through and through. So yeah.
That's awesome. Well, you've got such a great story, and it's just been amazing to hear about your progress through all of this, and how you've come out and you have this vision of yourself now that's more of embracing the technologist in you. So thank you so much for taking the time to share all of that with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for reaching out. This was a lot of fun. I'm very grateful, and look forward to continuing to network and get to know people who are in situations like mine, because I genuinely believe that, I think I wrote this in that article, there's a constant question of, how are we going to train the next generation of software developers? And I'm like, they're already here. It's people like me, it's people like you who are we used to think of ourselves as non-technical, but now we're embracing that, we can be an engineer, even if it's a second career, even if it's learning engineering concepts or, taking an engineering class. It's just taking steps toward that. That's how we're going to fill the technology gap and the software gap, is by embracing people who are already in the industry and just encouraging them to go a little bit further with their skills.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great advice. Well, thanks, Andrea, and maybe we'll have you on again sometime and talk about technology again and get an update.
I would love that. Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you so much, Melissa. This has been great.
All right, that was great. And I hope that Andrea is the first of many women in tech that we get to host on the STEMxm podcast. I'll be looking for others to invite on to chat with in the future. Andrea mentioned several resources for learning to code, which I've included for you in this episode's show notes. You can find those at STEMxm.com/episode 15. That's STEMxm.com/episode and then the number 15. Really quickly, I wanted to mention that I feel like I could have asked my last question to Andrea in a better way. My inquiry stemmed from this. Andrea and I work in very different fields, and I know that in my own field of civil and environmental engineering, many young women are afraid that the time demands of the job will prevent them from spending the time that they want with their families. Indeed, I've seen several women scientists leave environmental consulting for that very reason, and a couple of them went on to become teachers. These women are not to blame, so to speak. This is one of the issues that progressive companies will have to address if they're serious about fixing the leaky pipeline, or the women that we lose from the STEM workforce. Companies can solve this in different ways, like by offering flexible schedules, options to work from home, and via other creative work management solutions. But since I get to talk to these amazing women here on the show, I like to ask these successful women how they manage things. And as you heard from Andrea, she has come up with some pretty creative solutions for managing work-life balance. Maybe this is something that we could get a panel of women together for to discuss sometime. I don't know. Are you interested in that or potentially another topic? Let us know. You can get in touch with us on Facebook or Twitter, and you can find those at facebook.com/STEMxm. And then our handle on Twitter is just STEMxm Podcast. That's all I've got for now, so I'll see you in episode 16. Bye for now.
This has been an episode of the STEMxm podcast. Thank you for listening. We would really love if you could pop over to iTunes and give us an honest, positive rating. It helps more listeners find us to learn about STEM careers. Thanks again, cheers, and we'll catch you on the next episode.